Hello, and welcome to the COCC Forum on Racism in Our Communities. My name is Alicia Moore, Vice President of Student Affairs for Central Oregon Community College and the moderator for today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to provide you with a brief overview of the format of today's forum. First, I will introduce each panelist before they speak, who will have about 10 minutes to share their perspectives. We will then have a few minutes in which each of you can ask questions of the panelists by posting your question via Zoom's question and answer option. We will also have an open Q&A period at the end of our 3 sessions, giving you an opportunity to ask questions of any of our panelists. We would also like to thank our closed captioner and sign language interpreter for being with us today and helping make this forum more accessible to all. To get us started with today's Racism Forum, I'd like to begin with the COCC Native Land Acknowledgement. COCC would like to acknowledge that the beautiful land our campuses reside on are the original homelands of the Wasco and the Warm Springs people. They ceded this land to the US government in the Treaty of 1855. The Paiute people were forcibly moved to the Warm Springs Indian Reservation starting in 1879. It is also important to note that the Klamath Trail ran north through this region to the Great Celilo Falls trading grounds that the Klamath tribes claim as their own. Descendants of these original peoples are thriving members of our communities today. We acknowledge and thank the original stewards of this land. Thank you. Titled, How the Pandemic Has Disproportionately Affected the BILAPOC Community, today's events brings to light the many inequities faced by Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian people of color in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. I am pleased to introduce to you Dr. Lori Chesley, COCC President, to welcome us to today's forum. Dr. Chesley joined COCC in July 2019 and has been an outstanding advocate for community colleges throughout her career. Prior to COCC, Lori served in a leadership role for instruction and student services. And as a first-generation college student, Lori's academic career culminated in her receiving her master's and doctorate degrees from the University of Notre Dame. Lori.
Pardon me. Thanks, Alicia. My name is Lori Chesley, and I am proud to be the president of Central Oregon Community College. Racism in our society can show itself in dramatically obvious ways, as in the killing of George Floyd or the proclamations of white supremacists. At other times, it is more subtly pernicious, reflecting hundreds of years of oppression, disenfranchisement, and dehumanization. As I've said at previous forums, one of the most noble purposes of higher education is to promote understanding and empathy, to make clear for everyone to see both individual and systemic injustices like racism. Today's forum, How the Pandemic Has Disproportionately Affected the BILAPOC Community, sheds light on the impacts of systemic racism on our communities of color today. Thank you for joining us for this important forum.
Thank you, Lori. Our first panelist is Dr. Sarah Barron. Sarah is an Assistant Professor 1 of Public Health Science at Central Oregon Community College. Her passion is in health promotion and community development. Sarah has more than 25 years of experience in the public health field, serving as a health educator at a county health department, school community partnerships director, and later grants developer. She received her Bachelor's of Arts in Latin American Studies with a focus on public health and a minor in Spanish, and a master's in public health from Tulane University, and her doctorate degree in educational leadership from California State University, Fresno. Today, Sarah will share with us data regarding the impacts of COVID-19 on communities of color and some strategies to address health inequities in the United States. Sarah, take it away.
You should be able to see my screen now. Are we good to go? Thumbs up. Awesome. Great. So I'm going to give a little short presentation on taking a closer look at how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted the BILAPOC communities. And so let's just start off by looking at some data here. I have a bar chart here, and this is adjusted for age. Other racial groups are this many times more likely to have died of COVID-19 than white Americans. And when we look at this, we look at Pacific Islanders, 2.6 times more likely to have died of COVID-19 than white Americans. And we can look at Latinx, 2.4, Indigenous, 2.2, and Black 2 times more likely to have died of COVID-19 than the white Americans. So these rates are disproportionate and show a health disparity, a health difference. And when we start looking at these rates closer, they can really reveal health inequities. And when I talk about health inequities, I'm talking about things that are systemically not just. There might be biases in the systems. And in public health, one of the big tenets is really addressing this and creating health equity. And so how we do this is really looking at 3 different paths. And this is from CDC. The programs, really looking at our programs from educational programs to public health programs. What strategies are we doing? Measurement, and you just saw one right now before I showed you that bar chart with the different rates, and getting data and disaggregating that data and breaking that data apart and making sure that we have representation of that data is key. Getting voices heard through data being represented. And of course, policy is very important. Laws, regulations, looking at population health. And this is important with health equity. So I got to throw this down as the social determinants of health. And social determinants of health are really key. And we're going to be talking about these today. The strategies that we're going to hear from the panelists are really addressing these social determinants of health. Looking at structural inequities, bias, socioeconomics, and gaps in policies. And so these are all considered social determinants of health. Someone's ability to access healthcare. Does everyone have health insurance and equal access to health insurance? Do we have social networks that support us in our community? Do we have that? How about economic stability, community environment, food security? And so when I look at these, I start to think of things that have happened in our communities and the communities in Warm Springs that went through a water crisis during COVID-19 and water infrastructure. This is a social determinant of health, having access to clean water. How about our rising housing cost and people's abilities to pay that? That's the best basic need. Systemic racism, the ability to go in and feel like you can talk to your doctor, that your doctor is listening to you, that you feel comfortable in the healthcare system, implicit biases. And this is key. And that's something that the public health system is really starting to address and talk about more. Hunger, food insecurity. Our rural areas, having access to rural areas, having access to services, these are all considered social determinants of health. And so I just want to go through 3 different strategies to address health inequity. I want to talk about some of our health departments, some of the things that they're doing. I'm going to highlight Jefferson County. They're taking their vaccination clinics out into the community, going to churches. This is one where they're filming and they're using Facebook and media, social media, multiple languages, bringing it to the community and engaging with the community. Warm Springs with their clinics at IHS. And then the other key strategy is building that human connection. And so it's one thing to put the clinics in places where people can access it. But what about those relationships? And it's one thing when you have trust that's not there with, let's say, you don't feel comfortable, you need people from the community that you have trust with and that you can talk to. And so think about that. One of the things that they're talking about is creating a community core and really using people from the community. And this is something that just opened up where people can sign up and really become promotoras. They can promote, they can talk to their community barbershops, the layperson to the community health worker. And this is what you're seeing is community core, where we're engaging and talking to our community members, your next door neighbor, and engaging the people that live in your community and that from different communities to be spreading information. And then the other key strategy is really building up our workforce and to really address the older adult population. And before I showed that age-adjusted bar graph, when it's not age-adjusted, you'll see the Indigenous population is at the very, very top. And the Indigenous population has lost a disproportionate amount of their older adult population, and this has impacted their community significantly. And I know one of our panel speakers is going to be talking a little bit about that later, but this is something too, is that we really need to be thinking about that. And then lastly, this is something we can do at COCC, is that when we support people's educational career pathways, when we really put them on the pathway, a direct pathway, we give them a clear pathway, we give them opportunities, we make a difference. And so these are some of the things that are key. And those are some of the things that I pulled from. I have to note that at APM Research Lab took it upon themselves to really start getting that data from the states to disaggregate it, to lift up. Atlantic took this on to start saying we need data to really look at the disproportionate effects and how people are being impacted. And so these are some of the resources that I pulled from today. And that is it.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. You know, when we first started talking about this, Sarah spent all sorts of great time educating us about the deep amount of data we have about how inequities have faced our communities of color long before COVID was around, but certainly has been exacerbated since then. And so I know she's an absolute fountain of knowledge if anyone ever wants to engage in longer conversations with her. But with her introduction to some of that data, would love to entertain any questions that people may have, and you can do so by posting that in the Q&A feature as a participant. But in the meantime, Sarah, one of the questions I was thinking about when you were talking is, why is data collection so important to addressing or so critical into addressing health inequities? You mentioned in this and maybe some previous conversations that some states simply aren't reporting demographic data. Why is that important? How does that influence what you might have shared with us?
It's interesting when I was preparing for this talk and going back, and I saw this over the past year with CDC. Now, when you go to CDC, the CDC data tracker is very up to date with demographic data. But in the very beginning, it was not being reported out. And right now, APM research was saying that 94% of the states are reporting out demographic data, but in the beginning they were not. And that there was a real call to action to start saying to push that data out, because when you saw that data of the rates and the disproportionate rates, it becomes very clear that there's something in the system that we need to address, and it influences the vaccine rollout, who gets vaccinated first. It's key for policy making. And so if data is not collected and if someone's voice is not heard, the policy decisions aren't driven by that. That's why it's so critical for people to participate in census data collection, to even states pushing this data out for people to analyze.
Great, thank you. As a follow-up question, I see a couple folks are typing, but just a follow-up question to that. One conversation I've stumbled into with some other recent work around some of the impacts around communities of color, more in the educational system, but is sometimes the sample size is so small because we define this cohort in such a narrow way. What happens when sample sizes like that are too small? How do we capture those voices?
That's really interesting. And so I'm very into quantitative research, very into numbers. But when I started realizing that quantitative numbers, you don't have power, you don't have enough sample size to really do sometimes drive this data, or sometimes you have to worry about confidentiality when the numbers drop so low. And this is where qualitative data, this is where stories are key, and they really raise up, and they humanize the data too. They put faces to it. And I think sometimes it's important that when we have low sample numbers, we need to look at qualitative data and maybe even look at both to really see what's going systemically and what the issues are.
You bet. Yeah, it's often the numbers and the stories together tell the real picture, and it's hard to see one without the other. There's a question posted by one of our participants. Are the disparities the same in both concentrated communities of color and of people in color in more diverse communities? I think actually less ethnically diverse communities. So if you're in a community that's predominantly a white population, are the disparities in health inequities the same there for individuals of color as it would be if you're in a more ethnically diverse community?
That's a really good question. And I can't give you an exact answer, yes or no, but when I pulled up a map of disparity, and one of the places that I like to go to is the CDC, I started to see disproportionate data happening in rural areas and in pockets. So you'll see the map pull up, and then with the indigenous communities, you'll see in Arizona, you'll see the data start to show geographically showing up. And so to answer that question, it becomes a regional, and it's not a yes or no, it's about region. And I hope that I answered that question. So again, the CDC map that shows disproportionate data, that map starts to kind of enlighten how things can change from urban to rural areas across the United States.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there's never, just an easy answer to some of these questions. They're deeply complex, but I appreciate the referral to the Centers for Disease Control. So thank you.
Yeah, that map is awesome.
Well, thank you, Sarah. We're going to switch gears, and I'm pleased to introduce to you our second panelist today, Kelsey Freeman. Kelsey currently serves as the Native American College Prep Program Coordinator at Central Oregon Community College, where she works with Native students from the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, as well as Native students from across Oregon who are preparing for the transition to college. Additionally, she facilitates COCC's Allies for Equity training series and teaches a cultural responsiveness in health careers course. Kelsey is also the author of the book, No Option But North, The Migrant World and the Perilous Path Across the Border, based on her year of interviewing Central American migrants on their journey north via her experience through a Fulbright Fellowship. Kelsey received her bachelor's degree from Bowdoin College in Government and Legal Studies, and we are grateful for her work in our communities. Kelsey will briefly share with us her experiences in witnessing how COVID-19 impacted the local Central Oregon community, especially within the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, which also experienced tremendous trauma between COVID and its community's water crisis. So thank you in advance, Kelsey, for what you're sharing with us today.
Thanks, Alicia. And I'm happy to be here and have these conversations, especially as we continue to see the effects of systemic racism across the country. So Sarah did a great job at talking about and getting us on the same page about how the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated existing inequities. So what I'll share is a little bit of what I've seen in terms of how the pandemic has disproportionately affected our Native students here in Central Oregon. So how this has played out on a local level. And then also a little bit of some of the factors that stem or that play into these inequities. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Just as a note, I'm not here to speak for any community by any means. I'm here to share some of the systemic factors that we know and that we've seen contribute to the disparities that we're seeing. So one of the things that I think the pandemic has helped us realize as a nation is that the present is not neutral. We are not divorced from our history. So the historical forces, historical inequities, the result of oppressive policies, all contribute into the social determinants of health that Sarah mentioned. So who has access to preventative health care? Who has access to clean water? Who has access to providers who look like them and who serve them without bias? So all of these factors stem from history. So I'll mention just a few kind of historical, I call them historical exacerbating forces that play into the disproportionate impacts we see today. So for Native nations across the country, many of them signed treaties with the US government that Alicia mentioned here in the beginning. And that's the same for the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. They signed a treaty with the US government, ceding land, retaining fishing and hunting rights. And part of the deal with a lot of those treaties was that the federal government was supposed to maintain responsibility for certain key services like education and healthcare. Now, unfortunately, the federal government has really fallen short of that promise over the past, century. So services like Indian health services that Sarah mentioned are chronically underfunded, which makes it so that people living on the Warm Springs Reservation may not have the same access to preventative health care that, say, if you're living in Bend, you might have. Then we have to recognize how, again, the legacies of oppressive policies play into the present. So when it comes to kind of the way that the federal government systematically dismantled Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous lifeways, that plays a role in today's society, because if you no longer, have your land, if you no longer have your language, your first foods, your ways of living, that disrupts the healthy functioning of any community. And we've seen that for Native nations across the country. And then there's trauma that comes from this history as well. If you think about it, if your parents were taken to a boarding school where they were abused, taught they couldn't be themselves, forbidden from speaking their language, that has an effect on one's psychological well-being that then has effects on their children and their children's children. So this all plays into the health of a community. So that's why I say the present isn't neutral. We can't just look at these numbers and take them on face value. We have to consider the whole picture. So as we think about, well, what effects does this have on communities of color, and specifically on Native communities? I think for the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, from what I've seen working with students, Sarah mentioned there's unique difficulties that the tribes are dealing with, one of which is the loss of elders. People that bear cultural knowledge, that speak the language, and that ties to the cultural genocide that I just spoke about. Mental health difficulties are prevalent across our country during the pandemic, but again can be particularly prevalent across Native communities, again because of the historical trauma and the legacies of oppressive policies. And then there's a lack of economic opportunity on many reservations, including on the Warm Springs Reservation, that again stems from that disruption of Native ways of living. But if you lose your job, say you're living on a reservation, if you lose your job, it may be harder to find work again. And then, those economic effects are disproportionate as well. And then just with remote learning, I've seen the effects of this. Many students who live on the Warm Springs Reservation live in such remote areas that even hotspots won't function. So accessing remote learning has been really difficult this year. So many students have fallen behind or dropped out because of lack of access. And Sarah mentioned the overlapping crisis that is the Warm Springs water crisis. So ongoing water line breaks have led to large proportions of the reservation not having access to clean water for long periods at a time. Over the summer, 60% of the reservation didn't have access to clean water for over a month. And this was when COVID-19 cases were spiking. So in July, not surprisingly, with all these factors taken into consideration, the infection rate in Warm Springs reached 16 times the average for white Oregonians. So you see those disparities play out. Makes sense if you don't have access to clean water or running water. And then, so I'll share just a couple short tidbits of stories I've seen from students. So I had one student who participated in our Native College Prep program. She graduated from Roots High School in Warm Springs. She was so excited to be the first in her family to go to college. And then the pandemic hit, her mom lost her job, her stepdad lost his job. They were having a hard time paying expenses. Then due to some family trauma over the summer, the student ended up moving out with her stepdad, and they lived in their car over the course of the summer. And so she's trying to get started at COCC, but she doesn't have internet. She's living in her car. She doesn't have enough money to load minutes onto her cell phone. So getting in contact with me about dates and deadlines was incredibly difficult. We'd stay in communication, but she ended up missing all the deadlines to enroll at COCC. So she had a scholarship to come to COCC through our programs, but she wasn't able to use it because that lack of access to internet was too big of a barrier, even as we tried to sort through, well, how can we work on getting you housed? How can we work on getting you a computer, etc. It was too much for her at that time. Hopefully she'll come later on. I have another student in my college prep program right now who is in a similar situation where she and her family were unhoused. Now they're living in a hotel. I was really floored by her ability to advocate for herself. I was sending her materials for my class, and I called her up. I'm like, where do you want me to send these? And that's when she disclosed, oh, I don't have a permanent address right now. Could you drop them off at the hotel I'm staying at? I said, of course. And then there was another moment where she usually has her video on for class, but her video was off. She wasn't participating. I said, hey, are you still there? She messaged me immediately and was like, yeah, I'm at the laundromat. I'm doing laundry. I can't unmute to participate right now, but I'm here, I'm listening. So our students are resilient. They advocate for themselves, but our students of color shouldn't have to advocate for themselves more than our white students. I share these stories not to, make it inspire pity, right? It's more about seeing the systemic factors that put students in these circumstances, that put more barriers in their way to overcome just to enroll in college, for instance. So just to end here, I share a lot of kind of these overlapping factors for us to see the whole picture, but I want to recognize too that organizations in Warm Springs are leading the way on these issues, right? They know what the community needs. They know what approaches work. They know what's culturally relevant. So I think if we think about, well, how do we address these disparities? Supporting the organizations that are community-based and doing the work is a great way to start.
Well, thank you so much, Kelsey. Your wonderful insights, your experiences, your connections throughout Central Oregon really personalize the impact COVID has had to so many of our students and so many of our local communities. We do have time, just a couple minutes from our audience members who might like to ask a question. So again, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom, but I'd like to kick that off and just, Christy, Kelsey, sorry, I told you I was going to do that. You talked a lot about systemic racism and generational trauma. And that's something that just has so much deep meaning for so many people. How does those experiences in particular around generational trauma, systemic racism, how does that, for impact for our Native American communities, how does that directly relate to the pandemic itself? And how do you see that history manifesting itself today?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think there's so much that we could get into there in terms of, again, how history plays into the present. I think mental health has been a huge conversation around this pandemic generally. We know that our students across the board are struggling. But I think with talking about historical trauma and generational trauma, meaning just the way those historical patterns of oppression have manifested themselves across generations. I think when we think about you pair historical trauma or generational trauma with isolation, with inability to interact with peers, with inability to even log on to your classes if, again, your hotspot's not working, with the loss of your grandparent, with the loss of another elder. It's just these snowballing cycles that then make it really hard to heal. And again, I think there's been incredible work that many of the organizations that I just shared are doing to really implement Indigenous ways of healing to help students, right? I think that's the best approach, is solutions that are truly community-based, because I see it in my students. They thrive when they can get connected to those kinds of resources.
Great, thank you. I think many of us take for granted that things like a cell phone and internet access are, available just like that, and realize, especially in Western states where there's so much landscape, that's not readily available, and how that does impact our students and the flexibility we need to have to support our broader communities. So thank you for putting a face to some of that. And thank you for talking about the history behind how some of this stuff manifests itself today. Next up is Christy Walker. Christy is well known to many of you as COCC's Director of Diversity and Inclusion. Previous to this current role, Christy served as the college's Latinx College Preparation Program Coordinator. She's an active diversity committee member and chair of the Central Oregon Latino Partnership Program, the current co-facilitator for Better Together's Latinx Success Initiative, a committee member for the LGBTQ+ Education Work Group, and is on the Higher Education Coordinating Commission's Equity Advisory Council. She facilitates a multitude of trainings on equity, diversity, and inclusion for COCC and the greater Central Oregon community. Christy's discussion today will focus on how COVID-19 has particularly impacted the Latinx community, as well as share resources for help and assistance for those most impacted by COVID-19, with an emphasis on supports for underrepresented or otherwise marginalized populations. Christy.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And again, yes, my name is Christy Walker. My pronouns are she, her, and Aya. And Sarah and Kelsey, thank you so much for what you've shared with us. Just everything you said is so relevant. And to our guests that are here watching and participating today, I promised myself that I was going to do the best I could to not get emotional about these topics. But it's really hard not to. And I just want to put that out there that to me, one of the most important things that we can do, and I identify as Latina, and I want to start by saying that because as a Latina person, I have not faced these same disparities. I have been very fortunate. I've kept my job. I've kept my health. I have health insurance. I have access to resources really very, very easily. And so this is something that I personally don't face. And I think that a lot of people ask that question. If it's not happening to me, then why is it my problem? And it is your problem. It is my problem. It is our problem. It is our issues to face, because when a society and community is unhealthy, then we are all unhealthy. And it is our job to make sure that we can do what we can to help dismantle these issues, and that can manifest in many different ways. And when I think about the Latinx community, and I'm very involved in different committees, different work groups that do, because again, the Latinx community is my community, and I think it's important to be involved. And we hear about the different things where folks, like, I was able to come home and be safe. Right? Like, so again, I barely went out. There were months when I didn't drive north of Murphy. And if you live on the south side of Bend, you know what that means. And where I didn't drive, and when I realized one day that I drove, it was like this, like, whoa, like a whimsical moment for me. But the reality is that a lot of folks that identify as from the Latinx community, or really any other underrepresented community, that they still had to work. They still had to show up. They still had to put themselves in the line of fire, in danger, and be expected to do so with a smile. And when people started to do their protests saying that they were demanding their haircuts and they were demanding, demanding certain services, which yes, we all want those services. Like we all want to be able to socialize and be together. And I'm generalizing, but I think that's something we all strive for, is to be able to be together in a safe way. But these demands came at the expense of other people's safety. And yet they continued to work, continued to do what they had to do. But then with what kind of like guarantees for them? What kind of resources for them? So they still, while they were putting themselves on the line, they still weren't getting support. And to me, that's a very backwards way, where we have these expectations for people to still show up to, whether it's working like, you know, picking crops, or whether it's working at a grocery store or anywhere, to not be able to support them in this work that we just expect them to just do. It's backwards to me. And I just, so sorry, I'm getting emotional. I tried for the first 5 seconds, but it's hard not to feel this way. And especially when we see it in our community and you feel like there's nothing you can do, but there are things that we can do. And again, I start with empathy. And I've shared this story recently, actually at a board meeting. And I do have permission to share the story from a student of mine who she identifies as undocumented. And we were having this conversation, and I used to teach the Avanza classes, which now Dr. Claudia Biso-Fetzler does, and she's amazing. I just want a little plug for her. But when I was teaching these classes, she was a student of mine, and we've stayed connected. We just one of those students that you just connect with, and we reach out to each other every once in a while. And we were talking recently, and she was telling me that, you know, COVID-19 has been really hard for her family and really hard for her. And I was just like, you know, like, I'm so sorry. I was trying to empathize, you know, because again, I haven't felt this myself. But she started to tell me how, in a way, it has shed a light for other people in a way that she can explain what it feels like to be undocumented, that other people haven't been able to feel before. And she explained to me that she's been quarantining her whole life, right? So meaning that, like, people right now, you know, we're feeling this isolation, this, you know, lack of access in these socialized ways. But for someone who's undocumented, a lot of times that's the life that they live. That's their real experience, where they don't go anywhere unless they absolutely have to, because of the fear of being caught, the fear of being exposed, or the fear of being harassed, the fear of being turned against, the fear of being discriminated against, like all these things that come up for them. And so she told me that she and her parents, and she actually is one of the lucky few who did get DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And so she is one of those few lucky folks that can get a job, can get a license, but her parents are not in that same role. And so they've lived this way in quarantine their whole lives. And it just really opened my eyes. It's like, what a great way to explain that to people, that maybe this is a way that people can start to really realize and see what life is like, and hopefully show that empathy and be able to gain an understanding and not be so judgmental when it comes to, and it's not a political thing. It's a human thing. It's human rights, a right to live, a right to exist. And I was just so moved by her story. I did ask permission to be able to share it, because it's not my story to tell. But she said if I felt like it would help people gain more understanding, that to please do so. And that's what I'm doing right now, because I think that so many times we don't see what's happening to people when it's not the skin that we live in, when it's not in front of us, when it's not our experience. We tend to forget and we just go on with our day, but we shouldn't forget. We need to remember. And just this year, several students reached out to me looking for resources, looking for help. Students that wanted to be in school, wanted to study, wanted to continue with their higher education career, but they couldn't because they had to make a choice between helping their family or going to school, between paying for rent or going to school, between just so many things. And like Kelsey was saying, that technology piece with her student, that and yes, and don't get me wrong, because we have taken a lot of steps to help in that situation, which is awesome. And it has changed things for so many students. But it took a pandemic for us to get to that point. And that's part of the problem, is that now that these issues are coming up and that we're being able to recognize them, it's while it took this great thing across our world to happen, at least now it's here, right? And I'm always optimistic, right? It's like, okay, this pandemic happened, all these other things were happening, but at least now people know about it, and maybe there's something that we can do. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen here. All right, so what are some things that we can do? Check in on your loved ones and friends. Don't assume that everybody's okay, because people aren't okay. We've all experienced loss. We're all mourning something in some way. And so it's important to check in with each other. With people that engage in equity work, check in on them as well, because this is hard work that does weigh on us quite a bit. And so I do encourage you to reach out, that while we are strong, and we are all strong, it's always a good reminder to check in and make sure that everyone's doing all right. Follow and listen to BILAPOC activists, online, in person, anywhere, right? Like, listen to them, to what they have to say. It's not about people coming in and saving the day. It's about listening to what they have to say and what's right for their communities. And we have several, and I'm going to share with you a few different organizations that you can reach out to do that. But like Kelsey was saying, that with Warm Springs, right, they're doing the work. So they have plans in place. So if you want to help, that's who you should be talking to, not coming to them with your own plan. It's going and supporting and trying to help them in the plans that they've already made. Contact your representatives, pressure them. Let's start some campaigns. I will tell you, I have done some letter writing campaigns, and they've worked when you send a letter every day, let me tell you. But asking them to address the issues, right? We have a pretty diverse city council right now in Bend, and other areas are starting to be more diverse as well. And I believe that we have their ear about these issues. And I think that it's time to make these changes. Right now for the Bend Lapine and all the different school boards, again, there's a lot of diverse candidates that are running for office, right? Do the work, read about them. Don't just vote for someone just because they are someone who's from the BILAPOC community, but read what they stand for and then support them. Donate to organizations and nonprofits. That's one of the easiest things that you can do, is if you have some funds, donate them, right? Everybody can use this type of help. And this is one of the biggest issues that people have, is lack of funds and lack of resources. And then support your BILAPOC owned businesses, right? That we have so many here in Central Oregon that you can go to and support them, right? Buy their food, buy their clothes, buy their goods, employ their services, right? There's so many ways that we can help in that way. Stay tuned for in May for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We're actually going to put a directory of local businesses for folks to help support. And if you have an idea for that, please send it my way so that we can put it as a resource as well. And so some places that are already doing this work that you can donate to start is the Latino Community Association. These folks have COVID-19 Immigrant Family Relief Fund. And these funds help pay for rent, utilities, groceries. They help Dreamers renew any of their permits or any of their fees. Mecca Bend and Embrace Bend have started to work together to create a mutual aid fund, again, to help for COVID relief. And just so you know, COVID relief is awesome. Like the one that comes from the government is awesome, but it doesn't apply to everybody. And so that's why these organizations are so important, because it gives access to everyone and the folks that don't have the traditional access. And so here's a little bit of information here. And if anybody wants to connect with these folks, I'd be happy to connect you, or you can find them online. COBLA, Central Oregon Black Leaders Assembly. They've also, again, created a way to be able to uplift African Americans and people of color by providing programs. They have an internship program, a paid internship program, where they're helping to connect people, again, with learning, with being able to be part of the workforce, to gain skills. The Fathers Group. This group, again, is about enhancing the lives of children through education, leadership, networking. So these are all, I mean, I'm going through all of these pretty quickly. I found out at Asian Pacific American Network. I'm going through these pretty quickly because I'm trying to show that there are places that you can go to. There are places that are already doing all of this work that you can connect with. And if you just take a moment to reach out to them, you can start to make a difference. And so, sorry, I'm not trying to get too preachy here now, but there are things that we can do. And I know a lot of times people feel like they don't know what they can do. Here you go. I just gave you a huge list of that. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Christy. Once again, you shared tremendous insights for many of us in terms of strategies to help provide the supports and resources needed to build a stronger and more welcoming community. I'm again going to invite our participants to ask some questions using the Q&A feature. But in the meantime, I'd like to start off one from me and then one that was texted to me while you were speaking. But in particular for Christy, can you talk a little bit about, you've mentioned some of these, what COCC is doing to help alleviate some of these barriers?
Yes, absolutely. You know, I think that COCC is really working hard to eliminate some of these barriers. For example, when we did get the funds from the government to be able to distribute to students, undocumented students were not included in this. And so COCC, working with the foundation, was able to secure funds so that undocumented students were able to be included in getting some of this relief. And this was, these funds, all of these funds did not affect their financial aid packages. So this was money in their hands that they can use to help them go to any of these type of resources, any, you know, their utilities, their bills, anything that they needed help with, which was incredible, because I know that that's not something that was expected. And it was just, I know how many students were so grateful for that. We also had, working through the foundation, several donors that gave money for this exact thing as well. Another thing that just recently came up is that next year, we're not going to be raising tuition and fees. And that was an idea brought by Dr. Chesley, but agreed by the board and the COCC board. And that was, I mean, a huge news for people, because again, cost of education, I fully believe that people want to be educated, but cost is such a barrier. And that piece of just not raising, I think it instills a lot of confidence in our communities. That again, people are paying attention to what the need is. But we do also have, see, I was ready for this. We do also have these incredible resources for students at COCC. So like Thrive Central Oregon, that helps with housing and financial insecurity. And I only put a few things because when I was looking through our resources for students, the list was so extensive that we could do a whole presentation on that alone. And so the ASCOCC Food Bank, personal counseling, which again, to touch on what Kelsey was saying about mental health right now, this is a free resource for students to be able to tap into. And then financial resources. There's so many different ways for students to get help, that they don't have to struggle now. Are there some steps that students have to go through? Yes, there is, right? It's not going to be that you just call them and that they give you the money. There is a process, but there is a process and there are funds there. And so, and then not to mention all the different advisors. And, you know, we have at COCC, we have an Afrocentric coordinator, we have a Latinx program coordinator and a Native American program coordinator. And those folks, that's Blakely Evans, Michelle Carey, and Avelia Sandoval, who are always open and available for students to reach out to and get another form of support. And so, and then also, and I'm just going to keep going, Lynn Hong, Gordon Price, Marcus LeGrand. I mean, we have so many people in students' corners that are here to help them through these times. So, and the list can go on. So I will digress here.
Thanks, Christy. You're right. There are tremendous resources. And when you start talking about them all, it's pretty impressive. And so the more that the participants joining us today are talking with students, with community, with whoever, please send students our direction, because we definitely have the supports in place to help. I do want to open it up for questions for the entire panel. And I've got one that was texted to me that I'll start off with. You know, in looking at equity issues around the vaccine rollout. So this is a pretty big question. As panelists, if you could have been in charge of some of that and were looking back on things, what might have you done differently from your perspectives of wanting to bring greater equity to healthcare, greater equity to this pandemic? And whoever would like to go first is welcome to join in.
I'll go for it. And I raised my hand, but I think you might want to lower it. I would say that when I've talked to different health officers and different people, public health people in the community and different community members throughout the region and states, the ability to do things for your community the way you need them to be done, to work with local community members, that would have been something that would have been helpful. It's hard to take guidelines at the state level and apply them. And IHS did this. IHS, Indian Health Services, did this. Kelsey, you're shaking your head. What they did is they pushed it out and they said, we're not going to do a state approach. We're going to let IHS and their community follow guidelines. And you'll see that things opened up a little bit faster because they were able to do a more local community approach. And so it's a hard way you could balance it and go back and forth either way. But the decentralized approach sometimes is something to consider. So I hope that answered the question. So
you bet. Christy or Kelsey, other thoughts?
I would just add that with a issue that is so rooted in existing inequities, we have to have an approach that reflects those inequities. So we have to, if Black Americans are dying at a higher rate, if Indigenous Americans are dying at a higher rate, then those communities, in my opinion, should have access to the vaccine early on. Now, I think we've seen examples where that was done and where there was backlash. And that troubles me because I think that's where our nation or our narrative as a whole doesn't see what we've just talked about, doesn't see all the inequities and how they manifest themselves. So that's my hope in continuing to talk about these issues, is that then when the state or when communities do take an equity-based approach, we understand why they're doing that.
Christy, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I just I agree with both what Sarah and Kelsey just said, and that, you know, I just when the vaccine started to roll out, you know, I was super excited. Like it's a very hopeful moment, but I also started to think about like, okay, well, who's getting it first? You know, and in my mind, it should be the people that we have expected to be out there all the time, like the grocery store workers and the folks that are still serving the community, people that work in restaurants, everyone that is educators, right? Like, I mean, and I know that in some respects, some of those folks were, but it wasn't clearly laid out, right? Like, so I know that if it hadn't been for so many of the grand efforts from like the Latino Community Association and Mecca Bend, that a lot of people wouldn't have known from the Latino community, they wouldn't have known that this was accessible to them. Mm-hmm. And so making sure that people knew about this and that they had access to the information, because we can do great things, but if people don't know about it, then that's not going to do anything.
I'd like to tag on to that. I think you'll hear a theme here. When you engage the community and doing the outreach and really it is coming from the community, it becomes very powerful. And so some of those snapshots of Jefferson going into the community and engaging the church or the community members to really be volunteers and working at those clinics, you would see people coming to those clinics more. I had a slide in there where we did have the rollout, and it is disproportionate. It
Okay. Thanks, Sarah, Kelsey, Christy. I wish we could all be together in person to give you our thanks for sharing your incredible knowledge, insights, personal experiences, and helping us recognize that even though we've all been impacted by this pandemic, the impact to our community of color is far greater than many of us could imagine. And I'd also like to thank you for talking about some strategies on what we could have learned during this process and carry forward, whether it's to everyday operations once we're all back in that realm, or other traumas that may face our community. I also want to thank our participants, as your presence here today is a sign of your commitment to being an ally and combating racism in all of its forms. So thank you for everybody's engagement. I'd now like to turn over today's event back to President Chesley for her closing comments. Lori? And you're muted.
Oh my goodness, when will I learn? I want to add my thank you to all of our panelists, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and Vice President Moore for the outstanding work they've done to bring us this series of forums on racism over the past months. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a well-known book called The Tipping Point about the moment when the tides of opinions and actions shift and something changes forever. I wonder, when will we reach the tipping point on the issue of systemic racism? The point when we can all agree that it exists and must be confronted with action. I don't know, but let's all work together to make that time sooner rather than later. Thank you very much for attending today.